This is a music history podcast where we go deeper into events that briefly get touched upon on my daily Music History Today podcast, found here every day, including the weekends, actually. Please like, subscribe, etc., like everybody else tells you. Anyway, this first event did have some effects on music, and we will mention those effects in detail. However, we are going to spend more than the average amount of time that we would normally do on the event itself and that particular week because the events of that week warrant it. We will, for one sentence only, say something about politics. Otherwise, we will not delve into the political ramifications of the event, but mainly the musical ones. We will briefly debunk a major conspiracy theory surrounding it, and as you will find out later, this event is also personal and also involves death and a lot of it. Some of you may be triggered over it. I know that I still do whenever I have to go into a tall building or watch footage on television. Therefore, listener and viewer discretion is advised. Also, for you video watchers out there, we are not going to show anything from the events of that day or even the aftermath. Sorry. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's begin. On September 7th, 2001, Michael Jackson held the first of his two 30th anniversary star-studded tribute concerts at Madison Square Garden in New York City. That same day, singer Ryan Adams recorded a music video for his song, New York, New York. In the video, Ryan stood on the Brooklyn side of the East River at Brooklyn Bridge Park with the skyline of Lower Manhattan behind him. Among the buildings of the skyline were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. On September 10th, 2001, while testifying in front of Congress about $3.2 trillion in missing defense money, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called the Pentagon bureaucracy the biggest threat to America. Rumsfeld was in the middle of his 7th month as Defense Secretary in the new George W. Bush presidential administration. On the evening of September 10, 2001, Michael Jackson performed the second of those tribute concerts at the Garden. Now, meanwhile, on September 10, 2001, yours truly, who has lived in New York City since 1996, went to the Borders Books and Music at the World Trade Center after work to buy something. The World Trade Center complex, much like it does today, had a mall. I guarantee you that none of us figured that our next day would be rather life-changing. It occurred to me the other day that there is now a complete generation that has graduated high school and college and has been in the workforce for at least a few years out of college who weren't even born when the events of September 11th happened and have about as much attachment to the events that took place that week as most of Generation X have to November 22nd, 1963, and President John F. Kennedy Jr.'s assassination. In fact, unless you were born before 1990, you probably vaguely remember watching what happened in a school classroom. Also, in order to understand the reaction, you have to remember the times. Therefore, a quick history lesson on the events of the day and also that particular week, because while the events of September 11th have been covered in numerous documentaries, the aftermath tends not to be, especially one event that put the fear of God into everybody in New York City and Washington, D.C. The morning of Tuesday, September 11th started out as a pretty, relatively warm, sunny day in New York City and Washington, D.C. Basketball icon Michael Jordan announced that morning via fax to the media that he was coming out of retirement to play for the Washington Wizards. What's a fax? Well, fax is you know what, just Google it, kids, and get off my lawn while you're at it. Anyway. In New York City, it was election primary day for the local city elections, including one for mayor. Due to term limits, then Mayor Rudy Giuliani wouldn't run and couldn't run again. In retrospect, probably a good thing. Anyway, musically, there were new album releases that day from Jay-Z, Mariah Carey, and Bob Dylan. Singer, actor, and writer Seth MacFarlane of Family Guy fame and rapper and actor Marky Mark Wahlberg were both scheduled to be on early morning flights out of Boston, Massachusetts, both of them going to Los Angeles that morning. Both of them missed those flights, one due to a changed meeting and one apparently due to a hangover. Those flights, both Boeing 767s leaving Boston Logan International Airport, were the two planes that went into the World Trade Center. The first one, American Airlines Flight 11, left Boston at 7:49 a.m. and hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., taking out the 93rd through 99th floors. Then, United Airlines Flight 175 left Boston at 8:14 a.m. and hit the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., taking out the 77th through the 85th floors. American Airlines Flight 77 was a Boeing 757 that left Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. at 8:20 a.m. on its way to Los Angeles. Instead, it ended up hitting the west wall of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. at 9:37 a.m. United Airlines Flight 93 was a Boeing 757 that left Newark International Airport in Newark, New Jersey at 8:42 a.m. on its way to San Francisco. According to interviews conducted with two men who had organized this whole event, that plane was on its way to attack the United States Capitol building. By the time that plane was on its way to the Capitol, the passengers had received phone calls from their families as the other planes had hit their targets. Passengers rushed the cockpit where the hijackers were to try to get control of the plane back. The plane ended up going down in a field in Stony Creek Township near Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m. Everyone was lost on that plane. 4 minutes before Flight 93 crashed into the field, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center had massive structural failure from the superheated jet fuel and did a pancake implosion, with one floor coming down on top of each other, each one sounding like, well, bombs going off from the impact of tons of concrete slamming down onto each other. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower did the same thing. Debris from that collapse struck and destroyed the attached Marriott Hotel, along with the nearby 47-story 7 World Trade Center building. That building burned for another 7 hours before collapsing at 5:21 p.m. Both the Marriott and 7 World Trade Center tend to be forgotten about during the telling of 9/11. By the time the morning had ended, 4 airplanes were hijacked and crashed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania, and almost 3,000 people lost their lives. Among those people who were killed that day was jazz singer Betty Farmer, who was in one of the towers of the World Trade Center. Planes were grounded at 9:42 a.m. once the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, realized what was really going on. Subway service in New York City was completely shut down until about 2:30 in the afternoon that day. Bridges and tunnels coming into New York were completely shut down. Musically on that day, aside from the albums that came out, MTV and VH1 stopped playing music videos and instead played news reports from CBS News. Radio stations stopped playing music for the first time in decades and simulcasted newscasts. The Latin Grammy Awards, which were scheduled that day, were canceled. Sting, who was beginning an internet live stream when the attacks happened, only played one song, his song Fragile, and then he cut the stream. Paul McCartney, who was flying out of New York City from JFK Airport for London, England, sat on the tarmac watching the World Trade Center burning as his and all plane traffic was grounded for a few days. Later that afternoon, members of Congress went onto the United States Capitol building steps and sang "God Bless America." After the events of that day, the new century would be marked in the human consciousness as before 9/11 and after 9/11. There was another event the very next week that's kind of been lost in the annals of history that led to heightened fears among people, especially in New York City and Washington, D.C. On September 18th, the anthrax terror campaign started as letters were mailed containing the deadly chemical to various news organizations in New York City and Washington, D.C., and also to Congress people. 22 people came in contact with anthrax. 5 died as a result, including postal employees who handled the letters. The attacks made people afraid to touch their own mail. People thought that America was under attack again, leading to even more fear and nervousness. For years, the person who the FBI said was the prime suspect was bioweapons expert Stephen Hatfill. However, after finally being exonerated in 2005, the FBI turned their attention to scientist and new chief suspect Bruce Edwards Ivins. Ivins passed away in 2007. The FBI named Ivins as the main suspect in 2008 and closed the case officially in 2010. All of these attacks added to the mounting paranoia in the country in the fall of 2001. In fact, things got so crazy that the group Anthrax had to put out a statement saying that they were not going to change their name, even though people really wanted them to. Now that you've got the lay of the land, where does music fit into all of this? Well, aside from the Betty Farmer, Ryan Adams, Mark Wahlberg, Anthrax, and Michael Jackson references, an awful lot. For starters, the events of that day literally changed some albums. Dream Theater changed the cover art to their new album, as did Bush. Sheryl Crow decided not to release a song about having a lack of heroes. Dave Matthews changed their next single release from When the World Ends to Every Day. The Strokes removed the anti-police brutality song New York City Cops from the CD release of their album Is This It?, which also had been released on September 11th. A lot of songs were written about that day, from the Beastie Boys with An Open Letter to NYC, to Beyonce with I Was There, to Mary Chapin Carpenter with Grand Central Station, to 2 songs from Sheryl Crow on her album Detours. Bruce Springsteen put out an entire album about it called The Rising. Gerard Way watched the Twin Towers come down as he was riding across New York Harbor on the Staten Island Ferry. The experience of the fragility of life that day led to him following his dreams and starting his band, My Chemical Romance. On the censorship front, Clear Channel radio station companies had a list of songs that were, quote, of questionable taste, end quote, that they stopped playing. On that list were songs like Billy Joel's Only the Good Die Young, Dave Matthews Band's Crash Into Me, and every single song that Rage Against the Machine had ever put out up until that point, which the band saw as a badge of honor. Above all, music helped to heal the nation. Aside from the usual patriotic music, there were tribute concerts that were played, most notably the Concert for New York, which was held not long after the attacks, which had David Bowie, The Who, among many, many others. After years of arguments between officials, realty people, and surviving family members, the World Trade Center site was revitalized with new buildings and a memorial museum and park. I have only been to the museum once and broke down in the middle of it. Also, If you go to the Memorial Park, please be considerate and realize that it is not a place for you to take smiling selfies. It's a cemetery, as hundreds of remains still have not been found, and is as disrespectful as a certain presidential candidate posing with a smile and a thumbs up at Arlington National Cemetery next to soldiers' graves. That's as political as I'm going to get here. No talk about the ramifications from 9/11, like the Patriot Surveillance Act or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That is for someone else's podcast, not for this one. So that's it as far as that goes. As for what happened to me that day, well, here are my memories from living in the city, especially in that first week. When I first moved to New York in the mid-1990s, I worked for a very short while at a record store at the World Trade Center. Then I went into finance. One day in 2000, I had an interview for a finance job. That same time was a crossroads time for me, as I had also interviewed for an entertainment industry job. I was accepted for both, so I had a choice to make. Do I go with a job that would make me a ton of money, that I sort of liked, but didn't really want to do for the rest of my life? Or do I take a job that I loved, but didn't make even remotely as close to half as much money? I chose the job that I loved, and I still have, even though it paid less than the finance job. Good call, as it turned out. You see, that finance job was on one of the upper floors of the World Trade Center, where no one escaped from. On 9/11, I took the 7 train home to Flushing, Queens, where I lived at the time. And as the train turned the corner in Astoria, Queens to go to Flushing, I turned and stared at the smoke coming from Lower Manhattan. I remember walking in Manhattan during that first week in a state of utter disbelief and shock like everyone else. I have only felt that kind of silence in New York City 2 other times while living here. Maybe now 3, actually. The days when everything shut down during the COVID lockdowns in 2020, and the day after the Boston Red Sox came back and beat the New York Yankees during the 2004 playoffs. Go Red Sox! Sorry, I grew up in Massachusetts, lifelong Red Sox fan. Yeah, no. I remember Army vehicles blocking traffic going anywhere lower than 14th Street, as you couldn't go into Lower Manhattan unless you lived there. I remember the smell coming from Ground Zero. It smelled like rotten eggs and everything else that was really pungent. I'll never forget that smell for as long as I live. I remember the families of the missing lined up on 23rd Street near the Armory building, as that was the place to find out about missing loved ones. They eventually found out that only 18 people survived all the building collapses. I also remember the camera crews with reporters asking stupid questions to the relatives like, "How do you feel?" parading people's grief around for ratings. Stupid vultures. I've often looked back at that day as sort of a rebirth day in my life, so this day tends to be a pretty somber one for me, even all these years and now decades later. One little choice to pursue what I loved in reality ended up saving my life. Who knows if I would have kept the finance job long enough to be in that building that day, but knowing me, I probably would have. All I do know is that my life, along with the lives of a lot of people in the music industry and beyond, changed drastically in the days since the events that happened on September the 11th, 2001.